Hey again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Discussions of Darkness. This week, I wanted to talk about something that, as storytellers, we can often forget, but it's still important for us as players so that everyone at the table is on the same page and getting the same vibe. It's a bit of the other side of the coin of a previous episode for those who haven't watched the entire series yet. I talked a little while back about how the World of Darkness is in fact a global game, and this allows us to have characters and stories from all over the world, and it can often give us some interesting freedom in the stories we tell and the places that we visit. But to illustrate today's point, I would like to tell a small story from my time in the trenches as a freelance editor, because this is something I saw more than once, but this is probably the most egregious example of it, and I feel that it's something we can all learn from. But as we fire up the Wayback Machine, many years ago, I was given an assignment by a friend of mine who knew that I was looking for work. There was an individual who was hoping to get their novel all cleaned up and ready for publication. So I asked them to send me a couple of sample chapters, and I figured I would read over it and they could see whether my editing style and my way of discussing story worked for them, and then we could go forward and get everything cleaned up and ready for publication. The first half dozen chapters they sent me were not good, but that's not what we're here to talk about. The general plot line of this novel was there was a young man who was not quite old enough to be liberated from his very abusive family, and he was going to run away from home, he was going to find love in the big city, and it was going to end happily ever after eventually. First, we had to go through a lot of torment and a lot of personal demons. However, the issue really arose when our protagonist ran away to the city. There was no indication which city this was. All we could tell was from context clues. For example, we know the city got very cold and had snow because at one point in time our protagonist was caught out in bad winter weather. Other than that, we do not know if this was Chicago, New York, LA. All we could say for certain is it probably wasn't Miami or Tulsa. There was no indication in the architecture as to where we were. There was no indication in the accents or how people spoke. There were no particular sites mentioned. There were no areas of historic importance. And as a result, it became really faceless. And it really sucked a lot of the life out of the story because your setting needs to be a character in the unfolding tale that you're telling. And that was becoming a bigger and bigger problem as this particular story went on. Now, while the client and I did not end up working out well together, that was an editorial critique of mine that really stuck with me because it was the first time I had ever seen a story where the setting had been completely sucked dry of life and personality and identity. And it's a thing that I feel we should remember as storytellers, particularly in a modern fantasy game, that we need to have that personality and backdrop in our games to really influence where it is things are taking place and what's going on. Now, this applies both to the mortal and supernatural realms. For example, if you're running a Changeling the Lost game, then your hedge needs to have personality. It needs to be threatening. It needs to be changing. It needs to be weird and whimsical and unusual. If you're running a Werewolf the Apocalypse game and your characters spend any amount of time in the Umbra, that realm needs to feel otherworldly and dreamlike and liminal and all of those good things. However, with that said, if your game takes place in Chicago, it needs to feel like Chicago. You need to both mention actual places. You need to give the feel of this location. Is it mean? Is it dirty? Is it tough? If you're in New York, when in New York are you? The New York of 1970, 1960 is very different from the New York of 1980 or 2000 or 2020. Are you in LA? What part of LA are you in? Or is it one of those things where you get to see all sides of Los Angeles, the glitz and the glam and the wealth and the power, as well as the crippling poverty and the horrible things that happen down on the streets and in the gutters? And that dichotomy can very much be a part of the story that you're telling, especially if you're in a game where your players move from one world to another and you want that to be kind of thematic as to what's going on. And telling a story with a place like that, making it the central backdrop for your chronicle, can be a bit of a challenge, especially if you as an individual have never been to that place. If you've never traveled overseas as an American, then it might be difficult to tell a story in Paris or London or Tokyo. If you're not from America, there are a lot of things we do over here that seem made up to the rest of the world, but I assure you it is the way we are in the barbarian nation. And these are things that a little bit of preparation, a little bit of homework goes a very long way, both as a storyteller and as a player. So don't necessarily limit yourself to only telling stories or only running games in places you've personally been to or that you've done deep rabbit hole dives on the internet about. But take a little bit and really look at where it is you're going to be. Check out photos, watch videos, read a couple of historical accounts, things like that. It can really help you bring home the personality of the location that your game is going to be in and that your chronicle is going to take place in. More than that, just getting the details right in that way is very helpful and it can add a lot to your game. More than that, though, it can really help you figure out the themes that you want and what is going to really play well with your chronicle and the story that you're telling and the characters that your players are bringing to the game. As an example, if you want to run a story about corruption, or if you want to do something regarding the fallibility of human nature, whether it's vampire or changeling or any other sphere, Los Angeles is the go-to city for that because it has a history of ridiculous corruption, including the LAPD, who is usually in the top 5 most corrupt police departments in the US. Just something to keep in mind for folks out there who are looking for a particularly dark setting that reflects reality. On the other hand, if you wanted to do something that feels more remote or where things are very self-contained, you wouldn't put it in a major city like that where people are coming from all around and moving in thousands and thousands every day, but you might put it in a city in the middle of nowhere in Alaska, for example. You might want to be out in Texas where, yes, this is a major city, but it is hard to get to unless you're coming in by plane. You might even put it on a remote island community. If you wanted to run a World of Darkness game out in Hawaii, that could be an interesting twist that not everyone saw coming. And these are just some things to consider and some things to keep in mind because you already have a lot of moving parts and pieces. But this is one of those little details that will really stick with your players if you pull it off right. More than that, if it becomes a habit for you as a storyteller or even as a player, if you want to do this with your characters and you want to make sure that the places they're from influence them and are very obvious to the character's makeup, it can really help you. And once it becomes habit, you're just going to do it automatically. It might take a little bit of getting used to, a little bit of time when you do it in the beginning, particularly if you're not used to doing research on locations or if you're reaching out for something that is really far outside your wheelhouse. But as with anything else, the more often you do it, little changes that you maintain can have a big effect over time. So that is the piece of advice I would give this week, particularly since I know a lot of us tend to reach for more exotic locales that we've never actually been to, and we can often feel like we've bitten off more than we can chew when it comes to making these places feel real, and we end up over-relying on the supernatural to fill in the blanks in our personal knowledge. But that's all for this week. Before I go, I would like down in the comments, if you have run a game or played a game where the location, the setting, was very important to the story and you felt it really added to the ambiance of the game, tell us about it. Tell us which particular sphere of the World of Darkness it was. Tell us the location and tell us what your storyteller did to make it feel really real and bring it home to you. Alternatively, tell us the oddest location you've wanted to run a game in, but you haven't gotten to yet. Whether it's an exotic foreign locale, whether it's on the moon, whether it's in small town USA and you just couldn't figure out a way to really make it work, let us know. Maybe we'll get some conversation going and people can provide some interesting suggestions. Speaking of suggestions, if you have something you'd like to see on Discussions of Darkness going forward, feel free to leave that in the comments below. I am always happy to get requests from the audience. And lastly, I wanted to remind everyone to stay tuned and subscribe because I have something unique coming up, and I don't want to spoil too much. but it is a little outside the normal scope of this program, but it will fit very nicely if you're a fan of Discussions of Darkness and you enjoy what I've been doing for the past 20 some odd episodes. So, until then, happy gaming, everyone. Thank you for staying to the end of this episode of Discussions of Darkness. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking the video and sharing it on your own social media to help boost the signal. And if you'd like to help us keep the show and channel going, don't forget to hit that subscribe button as well. If you have any questions about the topic I covered today, or if you have something you'd like to see covered in a future episode, make sure to leave it in the comments below. Lastly, please check out the link in the video description to browse all of my World and Chronicles of Darkness supplements from Ezekiel Games. So far, we've covered Changeling the Lost, Vampire the Masquerade, Mage the Awakening, and Geist the Sin Eaters, in addition to a handful of general supplements that will be useful for any game set in the World or Chronicles of Darkness settings. Thank you in advance for your support. You're the ones who help us keep the lights on, so we don't fade into the shadows.